Sarah Murphy died 3 times that night. The first time, when the flames swallowed her home. The second, when Tommy stopped crying in her arms. The third, well, the third was when he appeared. The man they all called Red Wolf, the veteran the whole town feared, and who was about to change everything. The wind cut like razors through the Colorado mountains, carrying with it the smell of burned timber and broken promises. It was December 1944, and the war might have ended in Europe, but in the frozen heights of the Rockies, a different kind of battle was just beginning. Sarah Murphy pressed Tommy against her chest, feeling his small body shiver through the thin blanket. That was all that protected them from the cold. At 2 years old, the boy was still small enough to carry, but heavy enough to make her arms ache after hours of walking. His tiny hands clutched at her coat, and every so often he whispered "Mama" in a hoarse voice that broke her heart. 3 days. 3 days since everything changed. 3 days since flames devoured the little cabin where she and Tommy had built a life. After James died in Normandy, the fire wasn't an accident. She knew that. Everyone in town knew that. But nobody would say it out loud, because everybody knew who was behind it. And everybody was too scared to cross him. Sheriff Clayton Briggs, the man who decided that a war widow with a small child had no business owning prime mountain land. The man who made offers that weren't really offers. The man who got tired of waiting for her to say yes. Sarah had said no one too many times. Now she was paying the price. She stumbled over a hidden root, nearly dropping Tommy, who let out a small whimper. Her legs were giving out, her vision blurred. From exhaustion and cold, the snow was falling harder now. Thick flakes that seemed to swallow the world around them. How much further could they go? How much longer could Tommy survive this? She'd been walking since dawn, following an old mining trail that supposedly led to the next valley. But the trail had disappeared hours ago, lost under fresh snow and her own desperation. All she could see now were trees, endless trees, dark and silent, watching them struggle through the white. Tommy's breathing had changed, shallow, quick. His little lips were turning blue despite the blanket wrapped around him. No, not him too. She wouldn't lose him like she lost James, but what if she already had? What if this desperate flight into the wilderness was just another way of killing the only family she had left? The thought hit her like a physical blow, and she sank to her knees in the snow, clutching Tommy against her chest. The cold bit through her thin coat, through her worn boots, through her very bones. "I'm sorry, baby," she whispered into his dark hair. Mama tried so hard." Tommy stirred in her arms, his small hand reaching up to touch her face. "Mama sad?" he asked in his tiny voice. The question nearly broke her. Here was her 2-year-old son, cold and hungry and scared, and he was worried about her. "No, baby," she lied. "Mama's not sad. Mama's just tired." But even as she said it, she knew tired wasn't the word. Defeated, that was the word. Beaten, done. She closed her eyes and let the snow fall on them both. That's when she heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate, getting closer. Sarah's eyes snapped open, her heart hammering against her ribs. Out here, miles from any town, who could possibly? A shadow emerged from between the trees. Tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the deadly grace of a predator. He wore a military jacket, faded and patched, dark hair streaked with early gray, and across his left cheek, a jagged scar that looked like it had been carved with a knife. The scar that had earned him his name, Red Wolf. Sarah had heard the stories. Every woman in 3 counties had heard the stories. The decorated sergeant who came back from Guadalcanal, different, wrong, dangerous. The man who lived alone in the mountains, like some kind of wild animal. The veteran who'd been known to disappear for months at a time, only to show up in town bloody and silent, buying supplies with cash that nobody asked about. Some said he'd lost his mind in the Pacific. Others whispered he'd never lost it at all, that he'd found something darker than madness in those jungle battles. Either way, nobody went looking for Red Wolf. And nobody wanted to be found by him. But here he was, standing 10 feet away, studying. Her and Tommy with pale gray eyes that seemed to see everything. Sarah tried to speak, tried to move, tried to do anything except kneel there like prey waiting for the kill. Nothing came out except a whispered, "Please." Red Wolf took a step closer, and that's when Tommy did something that changed everything. He looked up at the scarred stranger and smiled. The smile hit Frank Sullivan like a mortar round to the chest, not because it was unusual for a child to smile, but because it had been 3 years, 2 months, and 16 days since anyone had looked at him without fear. Since Guadalcanal, since the night he'd earned his scar and lost something essential that he'd never quite been able to name. Children especially avoided him. Mothers pulled their little ones closer when he walked past. Fathers crossed the street rather than let their kids see the man they called Red Wolf. But this tiny boy, half frozen and clinging to his mother, looked at Frank's scarred face and smiled like he was seeing Santa Claus. Frank stood perfectly still, unsure what to do with this unexpected gift. The woman Sarah, though he didn't know her name, yet was clearly terrified. She held the child closer, her body trembling from more than just cold. Frank recognized that look. He'd seen it in the Pacific, on the faces of civilians caught in war zones. The look of someone who knew they were about to die and was calculating how much it would hurt. "Please," she whispered again. "Don't hurt him. Take whatever you want. But please don't hurt my son." Frank's jaw tightened. "Take whatever you want," as if he was some kind of bandit, some monster who preyed on women and children. Though maybe he was. Maybe that's what 3 years of isolation and nightmares had turned him into. He looked at the boy again. Tommy. The name came to him somehow, though he couldn't say how he knew it. The child's cheeks were flushed with fever, his breathing shallow. The woman wasn't much better, lips blue with cold, eyes glazed with exhaustion. They were dying, both of them. Another few hours in this weather, and they'd be just another tragedy that nobody would investigate too closely. Frank made a decision that surprised even him. "Can you walk?" he asked, his voice rough from disuse. Sarah blinked, clearly not expecting conversation. What? Can you walk? Because if you can't, I'll have to carry you both, and that'll slow us down." "Walk? Where?" Frank gestured deeper. "Into the forest. My place. It's warm, it's safe, and your boy needs both of those things right now." He watched her process this, the calculation in her eyes as she weighed certain death against the possibility that the monster might not eat them immediately. Tommy made the decision for her. He reached out one small hand toward Frank, fingers spread wide in that universal gesture children use when they want to be picked up. "Up," he said clearly. "Up, please." The word hung in the frozen air between them. Frank stared at the reaching hand. Such a small thing, such trust. When was the last time anyone had asked him for help instead of just hoping he'd go away? Slowly, carefully, he reached out and took the child. Tommy settled into his arms like he belonged there, little hands immediately reaching for the dog tags that hung around Frank's neck. "Shiny," he said with the simple wonder that only toddlers possess. Sarah made a sound that might have been a sob or a laugh. "Tommy, no, don't, it's okay," Frank said quietly. "Kids like shiny things." He looked down at the boy, who was examining the dog tags with the serious concentration of a scientist. Frank H. Sullivan, blood type O Protestant, next of kin. None. None. That's what it had said for 3 years now, ever since his parents died in the influenza outbreak while he was overseas, ever since his sister Mary stopped writing letters, ever since he came home to discover that the family he'd fought for no longer existed. But now the small person was holding his dog tags like they were treasure, and Frank felt something crack open inside his chest, something that had been frozen, solid since 1941. "We need to move," he said, more gruffly than he intended. "Storm's getting worse." Sarah struggled to her feet, swaying dangerously. Frank caught her elbow with his free hand, steadying her. "I can walk," she said, though her voice suggested otherwise. "Sure you can." Frank adjusted Tommy in his arms. The boy had started humming something, a lullaby, maybe, or just the random music that lived in children's heads. "It's not far." It was actually 2 miles through terrain that would challenge a healthy adult. But Sarah didn't need to know that. They walked in silence, Frank breaking trail through the deep snow while Sarah followed in his footsteps. Every few minutes he'd glance back to make sure She was still upright. Twice he had to stop and wait for her to catch up, though he pretended to be adjusting Tommy's blanket both times. The boy had fallen asleep against Frank's shoulder, his breathing easier now that he was warm. One small hand still clutched the dog tags. The other had somehow found its way to Frank's scar, resting there with the casual acceptance that only children possess. Nobody had touched his scar before, not even the doctors who'd stitched it up. He's not usually so friendly with strangers, Sarah said during one of their rest stops. Frank looked down at the sleeping child. Maybe he doesn't think I'm a stranger, but you are. I don't even know your name, Frank, he said after a moment. Frank Sullivan, Sarah Murphy, and this is Tommy. They didn't shake hands, too awkward with the child between them and too much history hanging in the air. But something had been exchanged nonetheless. Names had power. They made people real in ways that Red Wolf and the widow never could. Why are you helping us? Sarah asked as they started walking again. Frank was quiet for so long that she probably thought he wasn't going to answer. Finally, because someone should. The cabin appeared through the trees like something from a fairy tale, small but solid, with smoke curling from a stone chimney and golden light spilling from windows that actually had glass in them. A covered porch wrapped around the front, stacked high with split wood. Everything about it spoke of competence, preparation, and careful attention to detail. You built this? Sarah asked, wonder creeping into her exhausted voice. Most of it. Frank climbed the porch steps, fishing a key from his pocket, used some of the old mining camp foundations. The rest, he shrugged, had a lot of time on my hands. The inside was even more impressive. Clean, organized, warm. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, with a proper couch positioned in front of it. The kitchen was small but efficient, with shelves lined with canned goods and dried herbs, everything a person needed to survive and maybe even live comfortably, far from the complications of civilization. Frank deposited Tommy on the couch, carefully arranging blankets around the still sleeping child. The boy stirred slightly but didn't wake, his face peaceful in the firelight. He'll be warm here, Frank said. Fire never goes out. Sarah sank into a chair nearby, and Frank could see the exact moment when the adrenaline that had been keeping her upright finally gave out. Her shoulders sagged, her hands shook. The full weight of the last 3 days crashed down on her all at once. I don't understand, she whispered. Why would Sheriff Briggs? We never did anything to him. James served his country. I kept to myself. We paid our taxes. We never caused trouble. Frank added another log to the fire, keeping his movements slow and non-threatening. Sometimes that's enough. Some men don't like it when other people have what they want. But it was just a little cabin, just 20 acres, nothing special enough. Frank moved to the kitchen, began assembling food without asking what she wanted. Hot soup seemed like the obvious choice. Briggs has been buying up land in this valley for years. Your place was probably the last piece he needed for whatever he's planning. How do you know about Sheriff Briggs? Frank paused in his stirring. Because he's tried to run me off this mountain 3 times. Sent deputies up here with eviction notices based on claims that don't exist. Had the bank foreclose on property I own free and clear. He ladled soup into a bowl, brought it to her. Difference is, I shot back. Sarah's eyes widened. You shot at police officers? I shot at trespassers who were trying to steal my home. The badges were just costume jewelry. She took the soup with hands that barely worked, cradling the warm bowl like a lifeline. That's why they call you Red Wolf. Yeah. Frank settled into a chair across from her, close enough to help if she needed it, but far enough away to avoid triggering whatever survival instinct she had left. Funny thing about names, sometimes they stick whether you want them to or not. Is it true what they say about you? Frank was quiet for a moment, watching Tommy sleep. The boy had kicked off one of his blankets and was making tiny snoring sounds that somehow filled the cabin with more warmth than the fire did. What do they say? That in the war, Sarah struggled with the words. That you're dangerous. I am dangerous. Frank's voice was matter of fact, neither boastful nor apologetic. War teaches you things. How to kill. How to survive. how to not think too hard about the difference between the two. He looked at her directly for the first time since they'd sat down. "But I'm not dangerous to you." Or to him, "How can you be sure?" Frank considered this seriously, as if she'd asked about the weather or the price of coffee. "Because," he said finally. He smiled at me. For 6 weeks, they lived in a world that existed outside of time, that Sarah had intended to stay only until the storm passed. Maybe a few extra days to let Tommy fully recover from his cold. But the days stretched into weeks, and the weeks into something that felt dangerously close to contentment. Frank taught Tommy to whittle, his large hands guiding small fingers as they shaped pieces of pine into rough animals. The boy was fascinated by everything Frank did, the way he could start a fire with wet kindling, how he tracked deer through snow so deep it came up to Tommy's waist, the gentle efficiency with which he repaired Sarah's worn boots using leather from his own supplies. "Frank," Tommy would say, our sound still beyond his 2-year-old tongue. "Frank, come see," and Frank would come, always, dropping whatever he was doing to examine a particularly interesting rock or listen to a story that existed mostly in gestures and sound effects. Sarah watched these interactions with a mixture of wonder and growing unease. This wasn't supposed to happen. She wasn't supposed to feel safe here. Wasn't supposed to wake up each morning looking forward to the quiet rituals that had developed between the three of them. That Frank would rise before dawn, banking the fire and starting coffee. Sarah would wake to find breakfast waiting, and Tommy, already dressed and chattering about the day's adventures. They'd eat together in comfortable silence, Tommy providing enough conversation for all three of them. The days had their own rhythm. Frank would check his trap lines or hunt, always returning by mid-afternoon with dinner and stories that made Tommy laugh. Sarah would cook, mend clothes, and gradually take over the domestic details that Frank had been managing alone for years. In the evenings, they'd sit by the fire. Frank would carve or clean his rifle. Sarah would sew. Tommy would play with wooden animals that multiplied daily. Frank's idle hands turning scraps into a growing menagerie. It felt like family, and that terrified Sarah more than Sheriff Briggs ever had. Because families could be lost, she'd learned that lesson once already. The first sign of trouble came on a Tuesday in late January. Frank had been gone since dawn, checking traps in the higher meadows. Sarah was teaching Tommy to count using beans from Frank's pantry when she heard the distant crack of gunfire. One shot, then another, then a rapid series that made her blood freeze. That wasn't hunting, that was combat. Sarah grabbed Tommy and moved away from the windows, her heart hammering. Frank had taught her to shoot during their weeks together, just in case. He'd said, but she wasn't ready for whatever was happening out there. Tommy sensed her fear. "Mama, we're Frank. Frank will be back soon, baby." But as the minutes stretched into an hour, then 2, Sarah began to doubt her own words. What if he didn't come back? What if Briggs had finally found them? What if she was alone again? The thought of leaving this warm cabin, of taking Tommy back into the world that had tried to kill them both, made her physically sick. But staying without Frank wasn't an option either. His presence was what made this place safe. Without him, it was just another trap waiting to spring. She was packing supplies with shaking hands when she heard footsteps on the porch. Heavy, uneven. Wrong. Frank's step was lighter, more careful. This sounded like someone favoring an injury. Sarah positioned herself behind the door, rifle ready. Tommy hidden behind the couch. "Frank, it's me." But his voice was strained, tight with pain. She opened the door to find him leaning against the frame, his jacket torn and bloody. A gash across his forehead was still seeping, and he held his left arm at an awkward angle. "Jesus, Frank." "What happened?" "Hunting party," he said, stumbling inside. 5 men said they were tracking a dangerous fugitive. Sarah helped him to the couch, Tommy immediately climbing up to examine Frank's injuries with the serious attention of a tiny doctor. "Fugitive, me." Frank winced as she probed his shoulder. "Seems Sheriff Briggs has upgraded my status. Posted a bounty, dead or alive, but preferably dead." "How much?" $500. Sarah's hands stilled. $500 was more money than most people in the county saw in a year. More than enough to tempt desperate men into hunting down a decorated veteran. On the word of a corrupt sheriff, we have to leave, she said. Tonight, before they bring back more men. Can't. Frank nodded toward his injured arm. Shoulders dislocated. Need at least a day to reset it properly. Then what do we do? Frank looked at Tommy, who had curled up against his good side and was humming the same tuneless song. He'd been humming since that first night. The boy's small hand rested over Frank's heart, as if checking to make sure it was still beating. We make our stand, Frank said quietly. They spent that night preparing for war. Frank, working one-handed, checked his weapons and ammunition while Sarah boarded up windows and moved furniture to create defensive positions. Tommy, sensing the tension but not understanding it, helped by carrying bullets and announcing each one as if it were a treasure. Bullets make the bad men go away. He told his wooden animals seriously. Frank says so. Frank hadn't actually said that, but close enough. As dawn approached, Frank called Sarah over to the kitchen table where he'd spread out a hand-drawn map of the surrounding area. They'll come from 3 directions, he said, marking positions with pencil. 2 men from the south, following the creek. 1 from the east ridge, that's their sniper. 2 more from the north, probably including whoever's in charge. How can you be sure? Because it's what I do. Frank traced the approaches with his finger. Standard pattern for rooting out a defensive position. The question is whether they want to take me alive or if they're planning to burn us out. And if they burn us out, Frank was quiet for a moment. Then we have about 10 minutes to get to the root cellar before the smoke gets too thick. Sarah looked at the map, trying to process the tactical information her peaceful weeks had helped her forget. This wasn't just about her and Tommy anymore. Frank had chosen their side, and that choice might cost him everything. You could still run, she said quietly. Take Tommy and go deeper into the mountains. I'll stay here. Make them think. No, Frank's voice was flat, final. We stick together. But Tommy stays with us. All of us. Sarah met his eyes and saw something there that made her chest tighten. Not just determination, not just stubbornness. Protection. The kind that didn't calculate odds or weigh options. The kind that died fighting rather than abandoned what it loved. They came at first light, just as Frank had predicted. Sarah saw the muzzle flash from the east ridge a split second before the bullet shattered the window above Tommy's makeshift fort. She grabbed the boy and rolled behind the overturned table, her heart hammering so hard she was sure the attackers could hear it. Stay down, baby, she whispered into Tommy's hair, just like we practiced. Tommy nodded solemnly, clutching his wooden wolf, Frank's latest carving, against his chest. Frank was already at the south window, rifle steady despite his injured shoulder. He fired once, and Sarah heard a scream from the creek bed. 1 down. He called for to go. The battle lasted less than an hour but felt like a lifetime. Frank moved through the cabin like a ghost, appearing at different windows, firing, disappearing before return fire could find him. His injured arm barely seemed to slow him down. If anything, the pain seemed to sharpen his focus, stripping away everything except the essential task of keeping his family alive. His family. The thought came to Sarah unbidden as she reloaded Frank's rifle, her hands steady despite the chaos. When had she started thinking of them that way? When had Frank become more than just their rescuer? When had this become home? A voice called from outside. Sullivan, we know you're in there. Frank didn't answer, but he gestured for Sarah to move Tommy to the root cellar entrance. Just in case, you're surrounded. Come out with your hands up and nobody else has to get hurt. Frank finally responded. Funny thing about that, Sheriff, I count 3 of your boys down. Maybe you should be the one surrendering. A pause, then. We've got enough men to wait you out, and enough matches to burn you out. Then what are you waiting for? Another pause, longer this time. Sarah could almost hear the calculations being made outside. How much was Frank Sullivan worth? How much were they willing to risk? Apparently, not much. The final shot came from an unexpected direction through the back door that Frank had left unguarded. Because it faced a steep cliff, someone had climbed. Up from below, the bullet caught Frank in the chest, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor. Sarah's scream echoed through the cabin as she ran to him, Tommy wailing behind her. Frank's eyes were open, but his breathing was shallow, labored. Blood frothed at the corners of his mouth. "Sarah," he whispered. "Take Tommy, root cellar. There's a tunnel. I'm not leaving you." "Yes, you are." Frank's hand found hers, squeezed with surprising strength. "Tommy needs his mother, and he needs his—" Sarah stopped, the word hanging unspoken in the air between them. "Father." That's what Tommy had started calling Frank, though none of them had discussed it. That's what he'd become, without ceremony or declaration. Frank smiled, blood staining his teeth. Tell him his daddy loved him. You tell him yourself." Sarah said fiercely, "You're not dying. I won't let you." But even as she pressed her hands against the wound, she could feel his life flowing out between her fingers. The back door burst open. Sheriff Briggs stepped through, gun drawn, his face flushed with victory and exertion. Behind him came a deputy. Sarah didn't recognize young, nervous, clearly out of his depth. "Well," Briggs said, surveying the scene, "looks like the problem just solved itself." He started to raise his gun towards Sarah when Tommy did something that changed everything. The 2-year-old stood up from behind the overturned table, walked to Frank's side, and placed his small wooden wolf on Frank's chest. "Daddy sleeping?" he asked in his clear, innocent voice. Briggs froze. The deputy took a step back, and in that moment of hesitation, Frank found the strength for one last act. The knife appeared in his hand like magic, the same one he'd taught Tommy to whittle with. It flew across the room faster than thought, burying itself in Briggs's throat before the sheriff could pull his trigger. Briggs dropped to his knees, hands clutching at the wound, his eyes wide with shock and disbelief. "Daddy?" Tommy asked again, patting Frank's face with tiny hands. Frank looked up at the boy he'd learned to love, then at Sarah, then back at Tommy. "Not sleeping. Little wolf," he whispered, "just resting." And then Frank Sullivan, the man they'd called Red Wolf, closed his eyes for the last time. The deputy's name was Marcus Webb, and he was 19 years old. He'd been a deputy for exactly 3 months, most of which had been spent writing traffic tickets and helping Mrs. Henderson retrieve her cat from various trees. This was his first real call, his first time drawing his weapon, his first time watching people die. He stood in the doorway of Frank Sullivan's cabin, gun still drawn but forgotten, staring at the scene before him like a man trying to wake up from a nightmare. Sheriff Briggs was dead, the knife still protruding from his throat. Frank Sullivan was dying, blood pooling beneath him on the rough wooden floor. And in the middle of it all, a 2-year-old boy was trying to comfort a man who'd killed to protect him. "Daddy hurt," Tommy said, his small voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Mama, fix Daddy." Sarah looked up at the deputy, her hands still pressed against Frank's wound, her face streaked with tears and blood. "Please," she whispered, "help him." Webb holstered his gun with shaking hands. He'd joined the sheriff's department because he wanted to help people, not hunt them down like animals. Whatever Frank Sullivan had done, whatever crimes Briggs had claimed he'd committed, this felt wrong. Everything about this felt wrong. He knelt beside Frank, whose breathing had become so shallow it was barely perceptible. "What do you need?" "Bandages," Sarah said. "Something to stop the bleeding, and we need to get him to a doctor." But even as she said it, they all knew it was too late. Frank's eyes had taken on the glassy quality that Webb had seen once before when his grandfather passed. The look of someone already stepping across the threshold between worlds. Frank's hand found Tommy's, wrapping weakly round the small fingers. "Little wolf," he breathed, "take care of your mama." Tommy nodded solemnly, though he was too young to understand what was being asked of him. "I take care, Daddy. I big boy." Frank's eyes moved to Sarah. "The box," he whispered, "under the floorboard, by the stove." Sarah nodded, though she had no idea what he meant. And Sarah, "Yes, you were never just a refugee. You were home." Those were Frank Sullivan's last words. He died holding his son's hand and looking at the woman who had brought light back into his world. And for a man who had lived through hell, it was a good death. Sheriff Briggs was blackmailing people, she said quietly, Tommy sleeping in her arms. forcing them to sell their land for nothing, anyone who refused. She gestured at the destruction around them. Webb believed her. He'd seen things during his brief tenure, heard conversations that stopped when he entered rooms. There had always been rumors about Briggs, whispers about his methods and his wealth. But he'd been young, new, afraid to ask questions. Now he wished he'd asked more. "What will you do now?" he asked. Sarah looked down at Tommy, then around the cabin that had become her home. "I don't know. Go back east, maybe find work. Try to start over. With what money?" It was a fair question. Sarah had exactly $17 to her name, plus whatever was in the mysterious box Frank had mentioned. Even if it contained money, how far would it get her? And how long before someone came looking for Sheriff Briggs, asking questions she couldn't answer? Webb made a decision that would define the rest of his career. Sheriff Briggs came up here alone. He said carefully, pursuing a suspect. There was a confrontation. Shots were fired. Everyone died. Sarah stared at him. What? Frank Sullivan was a decorated war veteran living peacefully in the mountains. Sheriff Briggs was a corrupt lawman who got in over his head. That's the story I'm writing. But the other men? What other men? Webb's face was innocent. I see the bodies, Frank Sullivan and Sheriff Briggs, that's all. Sarah realized what he was offering. A clean slate. A chance to disappear without having to run. Why? She asked. Webb looked at Tommy, still sleeping peacefully despite everything that had happened. Because that boy deserves better than to grow up thinking his father was a criminal. Over the next few hours, they created a different version of events. Frank Sullivan had been living quietly in his cabin when Sheriff Briggs arrived with accusations of various crimes. There had been a confrontation. Both men died. Sarah Murphy and her son had been visiting. She was Frank's cousin from back east and witnessed the tragedy. It wasn't a perfect story, but it was believable. More importantly, it was simple. Webb helped Sarah search for the box Frank had mentioned, finally finding it buried beneath loose floorboards near the stove. Inside were documents, Frank's military records, the deed to his property, and a bank book showing an account in Denver with over $3,000 in it. There was also a letter, dated just a week earlier, written in Frank's careful script. If you're reading this, something has happened to me. The cabin and land are yours now, Sarah. The money too. It's not much, but it's honest, and Tommy deserves an honest start. You brought life back to a dead man. I can never repay that gift, but I can make sure you're both safe. Tell Tommy his daddy loved him. Tell him he was the best thing I ever did with my life. FSSARAH clutched the letter to her chest, tears flowing freely for the first time since Frank died. Deputy Webb quietly finished his report, then helped Sarah gather their belongings. By sunset, they were ready to leave the cabin that had been a sanctuary for 6 weeks and a battlefield for one terrible morning. You sure about this? Webb asked as Sarah took one last look around. She nodded, Tommy heavy in her arms. The boy had woken up asking for Frank and crying when she tried to explain that Daddy had gone away. She'd finally told him that Frank had gone to be with the angels, which seemed to comfort him somewhat. Angels watch over good daddies, Tommy had said with 2-year-old logic. Frank is good daddy, yes, Sarah thought. He was. They walked down the mountain together, Webb carrying their few possessions while Sarah carried Tommy. Behind them, the cabin sat empty, but not abandoned. Somehow, it felt like Frank was still there, would always be there, watching over the place where he'd found his family. The official story held. Deputy Marcus Webb's report described a tragic confrontation between a corrupt sheriff and a war veteran defending his home. It generated exactly the amount of attention Webb had hoped for, very little. Frank Sullivan was buried in the local cemetery with full military honors. Sarah and Tommy attended the service, along with a surprising number of townspeople who had known Frank only by reputation, but came to pay their respects anyway. The American Legion provided an honor guard. A bugler played taps. Tommy, not understanding the ceremony but sensing its importance, stood solemnly beside Frank's grave and placed his wooden wolf on the freshly turned earth. Bye-bye, Daddy, he said simply. See you later. Sarah took the money Frank had left them and bought a small house in town. Nothing fancy, just 3 rooms and a porch where Tommy could play. She found work at the local school, teaching children who were only a few years older than her son. People were kind to her, perhaps kinder than they needed to be. Word had spread about what had really happened on the mountain, and while nobody spoke of it directly, there was an understanding in their voices when they welcomed her to the community. She was the woman who had saved Frank Sullivan, and Frank Sullivan, they were beginning to understand, had been worth saving. As the months passed, stories emerged. People remembered acts of kindness they'd attributed to anonymous donors, food left on doorsteps during hard times, medical bills mysteriously paid, firewood that appeared without explanation. Frank had been helping the community for years, but he'd done it so quietly that nobody realized the scope of his generosity. Until after he was gone, Marcus Webb was promoted to sheriff after an investigation into Briggs's activities revealed the extent of his corruption. His first act was to return the land that Briggs had illegally seized to its rightful owners. His second was to name Frank Sullivan an honorary deputy, posthumously. Tommy grew up knowing the truth about his father, not the man called Red Wolf, who had been a figure of fear and speculation, but Frank Sullivan, who had been a protector, a teacher, and a good man who'd found his way home through love. On Tommy's 3rd birthday, Sarah took him up the mountain to visit Frank's cabin. The structure was still sound. Frank had built it to last, but nature was already beginning to reclaim it. Wildflowers grew in the window boxes. Vines climbed the porch posts. Animals had taken shelter in the rooms where a family had once lived in peace. Tommy, now big enough to walk the trail on his own, explored every corner with the fearless curiosity of a child. He found some of his old toys, weathered but recognizable. He traced his finger along the walls where Frank had carved notches to measure his growth. He sat in Frank's chair and announced that it was Daddy's chair with the same certainty he reserved for identifying colors or counting to 10. "Tell me the story again, Mama," he said as they sat on the porch, looking out over the valley where Frank had watched for threats and found a family instead. Sarah told him about the fire and the snow and the scary man who turned out to be the best man they'd ever known, about how love sometimes comes disguised as danger, and how the people who save us are rarely the ones we expect. Tommy listened with rapt attention, though he'd heard the story dozens of times. At the end, he always asked the same question, "And Daddy loved us, Daddy loved us." Sarah confirmed, more than anything in the world. Years passed. Tommy became Thomas, then Tom. He grew tall and strong, with his mother's dark hair and something of Frank's quiet competence. He learned to track and hunt and build with his hands. When he was old enough, Sarah told him about the war, about the things that had hurt Frank and the way love had healed him. Tom listened to these stories with the serious attention of a young man beginning to understand that the world was more complicated than he'd realized. When he was 16, he asked if he could enlist when he turned 18, to honor Frank. Sarah asked, "To honor my father," Tom corrected, "and to protect people who can't protect themselves." Sarah thought about this for a long time. Frank had been a warrior, but he'd also been a man who chose peace when he could. Maybe that was the lesson, not that violence was good or bad, but that sometimes good people had to be ready to fight for what mattered. "Your father would be proud," she said finally, on Tom's 18th birthday. They climbed the mountain one last time before he left for basic training. The cabin was gone now, reclaimed by forest fire and time, but the stone foundation remained. Wildflowers grew in profusion where the walls had once stood, and a family of deer grazed peacefully in what had been the front yard. Tom placed a new wooden wolf on the stones, one he'd carved himself, using the knife Frank had taught him to whittle with all those years ago. "Thank you," he said simply, speaking to the mountain, to the memory, to the father who had chosen him when he had no choice of his own. That night, camped under stars in the meadow, where Frank used to hunt, Sarah told her son one final story. "There was once a man who thought he was broken," she said. "He'd seen too much, lost too much, hurt too much. He lived alone on a mountain because he thought that's all he deserved. But then he found a family that needed him, and he discovered that broken things can still hold love. That scars don't make you ugly, they make you real." That sometimes the most important battles are the ones we fight not for glory, but for the simple right to protect the people we love. That man's name was Frank Sullivan, but a little boy called him Daddy, and that made all the difference. Tom listened in the darkness, storing the words in his heart alongside all the other gifts his father had left him. In the morning, he would begin his own journey, but tonight, in this place where love had conquered fear and sacrifice had built a family from strangers, he was simply a son remembering his father. Tom enlisted the next day, following in Frank's footsteps, but carrying his own dreams. He served with honor, came home whole, and married a teacher named Elena who reminded Sarah of herself at that age, strong, kind, and unafraid of loving a man who carried scars. They gave Sarah grandchildren who climbed the same trees Frank had once used for target practice, who learned to fish in the streams where he'd taught Tom to read water and weather. And every summer, the whole family would make the pilgrimage up the mountain to the meadow where the cabin had stood. The children would play among the wildflowers while the adults shared stories. Stories of Red Wolf, who had been feared. Stories of Frank Sullivan, who had been loved. Stories of the winter when a desperate mother and her baby found sanctuary in the arms of a man who thought he was beyond redemption. And always, at the end, someone would place a wooden wolf among the stones. A remembrance, a promise, a prayer of gratitude for the man who had shown them that heroes don't always announce themselves with fanfare. Sometimes they just open their door to strangers on the darkest night of winter. Sometimes they just love a child who isn't theirs by blood but becomes theirs by choice. Sometimes they just stand between the darkness and the light and refuse to let evil pass. Sarah lived to be 93 years old. She died peacefully in her sleep, surrounded by children and grandchildren who had grown up knowing they were loved unconditionally. Her last words were to Tom, spoken in a voice barely above a whisper. Tell them about Frank. Make sure they remember. Tom kept that promise. He told the story to his children, who told it to theirs. The details changed slightly with each telling. That's the way of stories passed down through generations. But the heart of it remained the same. A good man had lived. A good man had died protecting his family. And because of his sacrifice, that family had flourished, had spread their branches wide, had filled the world with a little more love than had been there before. In 1994, 50 years after that terrible winter night, the town erected a memorial in the square. Not a grand monument, Frank wouldn't have wanted that, but a simple stone bench with a brass plaque that read, "In memory of Frank H. Sullivan, Sergeant, United States Army Father, Protector, Friend." He showed up when it mattered. Children play around the bench now. Their parents sit there while waiting for the school bus or watching the 4th of July parade. Teenagers use it as a meeting place before football games and first dates. It's exactly what Frank would have wanted, something useful, something that brings people together, something that serves the community without asking for recognition. Sometimes, late at night when the town is quiet and the mountain wind carries the scent of pine and possibility down through the streets, people say you can hear it. A child's laughter, carried on the breeze, a lullaby hummed in a voice too deep to be a mother's, the sound of love being passed from one generation to the next, as steady and eternal as the mountains themselves. They call it the echo of the Red Wolf, but those who knew the truth called it something else. They called it the sound of a father watching over his children, even now, even always. And in the place where Frank Sullivan's cabin once stood, where wildflowers grow in profusion and deer graze peacefully in the endless summer afternoons, a family of wolves has made their den. They're not red wolves, those are extinct now, lost to time and the expanding world of men. These are gray wolves, returned to the mountains after an absence of nearly a century. The pack is led by a magnificent alpha male with intelligent eyes and a protective nature. He watches over his mate and cubs with fierce devotion, never straying far from the den, always alert for threats that might endanger his family. The locals call him Frank. Not officially, of course. The wildlife department has its own numbering system, its own scientific designations. But to the people of the valley, to the children who hike up the mountain with their parents and grandparents, to the old-timers who remember when a different kind of wolf lived here, He's simply Frank. Frank the protector. Frank the devoted father. Frank the reminder that some spirits are too strong to be contained by death, too loving to be silenced by time. On clear nights, when the moon is full and the mountain air carries sound for miles, you can hear them singing, the wolf pack, calling to each other across the ridges and valleys, their voices weaving together in harmonies older than human memory. But sometimes, just sometimes, if you listen very carefully, you can hear something else in that wild music. The sound of a 2-year-old boy laughing, the whisper of a mother's lullaby, the deep, gentle voice of a man who found his way home through love, and who guards that home still. This is the story they tell in the mountains of Colorado, when the snow falls deep, and the nights are long and families gather round. Warm fires to remember the heroes who came before. It's a story about sacrifice and redemption, about the families we're born into and the families we choose, about the way love can transform even the most wounded heart into something beautiful and strong. But mostly, it's a story about a man called Red Wolf who learned that the fiercest warriors are often the gentlest fathers, and that sometimes the greatest victory is simply knowing that the people you love are safe, that they'll always be safe, because you showed up when it mattered most, and you never, ever let them go. Thanks for staying with us through this journey. If this story touched your heart, pass it on. This is Still Standing Souls. Real stories, quiet strength, lasting hope.